Hi there, and welcome. My name is Jeff Bell, and on behalf of McLean Hospital, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this episode of our educational webinar series. Our focus today, mental health disorders in teens, and our goal is to provide some guidance for spotting the onset of adolescent mental health conditions. It can be tough at times to distinguish between so-called typical teen behavior and signs of emerging mental health conditions. But understanding these distinctions can be critical when it comes to guiding teens to effective mental health care. Our guest today is an expert in this area. Dr. Perihan Esra Guvenek-Cokol is a double board certified child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. She specializes in emerging mental illness in teens and young adults and serves as the medical director for McLean's Child and Adolescent OCD Institute, as well as an outpatient program for teens and young adults. Esra, thanks so much for loaning us your expertise today.
Thank you, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you with us. And before we dive into mental health disorders that can impact teens, I want to start by asking you to help us understand the typical everyday challenges that they have to navigate. It's not easy to be a teen today.
It's not. I mean, adolescence, teenagers is a period of an immense change, right? For teenagers, life is happening really fast, and their body change, their brain change, their emotions change very rapidly. So it's a really fast-paced period, and a lot happens. They learn so much, and they all try to navigate this fast-paced changes, and their environment change a lot, and their parents try to figure the process along with them.
You mentioned the brain. This is sort of a critical period for brain development, is it not?
It is. So what happens during adolescent period is our brains make a lot of connections growing up. The baby brain is small, and as babies grow, the brain creates a lot of connections, like bunch of synapses. And there's something happen during adolescent period, what we call pruning. The brain becomes practical. So what brain does is really consolidate the parts of the brain that are working, the connections that are important. They amplify and expand on these connections, and also get rid of the parts that are not working, the connections that are not important or not used, kind of clean that. It's a bit of a cleaning consolidation process, what we call pruning. And because it's so important, the pruning, usually problems around brain connectivity that can come up during that phase. So a lot of mental illness can emerge during the adolescent period, and something like maybe 50% of mental health disorders have their early signs are shown by age 14. So a lot of times, some mental health disorders come up later in life, but a lot of them have their early signs and symptoms come up and emerge during the adolescent period.
I want to talk about some of those signs in just a minute here, but first I want to continue sort of talking about the challenges that teens face every day. We've got behavioral development and identity development happening at the same period as well.
Yes. So what happens during adolescent period is, think about, these children, school-age kids, they are sort of at home a lot with parents, and parents are very active in their life. And then during adolescent period, teens start separating from their parents. So they notice their body change. Like, think about middle school, right? It's a full chaos. The friendships, the relationships become very complicated. The emotions of the teenagers are naturally really up and down. A lot of teens start feeling strong emotions. Puberty hits. They're physically, they notice the changes in their body. So it's a very chaotic, kind of normally chaotic phase. And then they sort of go through this transformation period during adolescent and then emergence of becoming young adults. I think it is. Oh, sorry. Go on.
I'm sorry. Please continue.
Oh, I was going to say, it's like a transformation phase. And I think for teenagers, they try to figure this out. and they start to figure out who they are, what kind of person I am, what are my values, what are the things I care about in life, what does the society want from me. And as they figure this out, the parents, try to support them. And obviously, that's a process. Like, it doesn't happen in a day. And it is painful, normally painful for many families.
What about some of the social challenges that teens have to navigate as well? Peer pressure, bullying, dating days, and so forth?
Yeah. So I think first, like, important to kind of understand why these are so challenging for teenagers, because, they are in a phase of learning. It's a very active learning process being a teenager. They try to recognize their own feelings. Like, all of a sudden the emotions start feeling really big, the anger, the happiness, emotional up and down, like emotional, like swinging in their emotions. This is all kind of, they try to figure out. They also try to figure out their body, body changes, sexuality, being interested in, romantically in peers. And then the whole value system, right? As a teenager becoming a little bit like middle to late teens, they start to really experiment and understand and, kind of figure out what their personality, value system, how they want to present themselves into the world. And of course, like, impact of the community, media, like social media, friendships, peers. This is it's a vulnerable period. So any impact, positive or negative, is going to affect how the teen will develop.
I can't help thinking that the world is moving a lot more quickly these days than it was when I was a teenager. And that's got to present some challenges as well.
Yeah. So I think the way I think about is, adolescence is a period of mistakes, right? Like, every teenager push boundaries, limits, because that's that growing pain to become independent. And they will, they will make they'll make decisions that are not very wise. And there's a biological reason for that. Like, our brains develop from bottom to the top. And the part of the brain, what we call prefrontal cortex right here, is a part of the brain that helps us to make good decisions. So that's the part of brain, handles the impulsivity. It helps us to kind of weigh pros and cons of the decisions we make. And that part of the brain develops the last. Like, it develops until like kind of late 20s. And maybe 30s for some people. So I think that is sort of naturally, teens don't have a fully developed brain that helps them to make good choices. So they will make some wrong choices. And the parents' job is, I think, society's job too, to make sure those mistakes are not too big and non-reversible, But, in today's world, especially with the social media, like, the problem is, like, when they make mistakes, it's sort of more visible and amplified, and that is a burden itself on teenagers, because they're like, they have like a real life presentation, and there's a whole online presentation and things on internet tends to stay. So that is really hard to kind of like regrets or like taking back is really hard for them.
Before I forget to circle back to this, I have to ask you about the ways that the pandemic created additional challenges. I'm thinking about isolation for some teens, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that really helps teens, like any person, adults and kids, but social connectedness is really important, especially when teenagers try to figure themselves out and try to make sense of what's happening to their body, their emotions, their social circle. Having, good, solid, helpful adults and friends, really important. What pandemic did to all of us, and more so for teenagers, is it really impacted the connectedness, right? We all felt a bit more isolated and disconnected, and that has a huge impact on teens. And schools, like, not having steady school access, and school can be a challenge for some teens, but like having their social circle, friends, the good adults at school, certain teachers, school counselors, not having access to that has been very hard. And we also see that this in, kind of clinically, right? There's a significant increase in, anxiety and depression with the pandemic. there is something like 30% increase in emergency room visits for teenagers coming with emotional, some sort of psychiatric emergencies. So there's a impact that we can actually measure by seeing how many more kids are seeking care.
This is a long list that we're running through right now in terms of challenges that teens face every day, even with good mental health well-being. Let's talk now about where the transition is to actual clinical diagnosed mental health disorders for teens. When is that line crossed?
So I think, someday, it's normal to expect teenagers to have big emotions, right? Big emotions, feeling confused about emotions, having conflicts with, friends and parents. Like this is all kind of growing pains of becoming an independent adult. But then problems are not solvable. Like then, it affects the way they function, right? Then, like, for example, it's normal to have anxiety about, like, if first time dating, it's gonna be anxious, but then anxiety or depression or like emotions become so strong that the teens cannot function in the world. They are too anxious to go to school. They're too anxious to hang out with friends, or they're too depressed or too sad to do the things they really care about. Then we become concerned, and that is really important to kind of seek help and reach out and try to sort of get the help as early as possible. We also know that with the mental health disorders, the earlier we intervene, the better the outcome's going to be. The longer something is sort of built up without being addressed, it's going to be harder to treat it. So that's really important to sort of recognize early and then get the help early on so it doesn't kind of accumulate and becomes harder to treat.
Can you help us with some perspective here? Any statistics or just general guidance in terms of the population size of teens with diagnosable mental health challenges?
Yeah, so when we look at anxiety and depression, something like 10 to 15% of teenagers have anxiety, and depression is similarly. And the numbers are sort of getting a little bit higher with the pandemic impact, I feel, but something like 8 to 10% of adolescents sort of report depressive symptoms. There are other, cannabis use, substance use is common. Teens, especially girls, struggle with body image and can have early signs of eating disorders, something like 0.5% of teenagers sort of struggle with some sort of body image problem. So this is sort of often what we see in teens is sort of these early signs of the emerging illness. And the key is really sort of teasing out what feels kind of normal, what feels kind of growing pains of an adolescent, and what feels like concerning. And the line is hard to really know. And it's not just parents' job to figure that out. And I always recommend, when your gut feeling as a parent sort of says something is a little off and you worry about it, like reach out. And I feel like pediatricians are a wonderful resource when it comes to that initial contact, because the pediatrician knows the kids, from like being babies into kind of becoming a teenager. Kind of talking to pediatrician could be an excellent first step to sort of tease out this what is normal and what feels like a little off.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about some of the more common mental illnesses that impact teenagers.
Yeah, sure. So I think, most common, and I see this a lot, is anxiety disorders are very common. And they're so common. And like a lot of times when I work with an anxious teen, like they feel like they're the only one who are very worried about things. And anxiety disorders are one of the most common mental health conditions in entire population. And the treatment, really works and helps. And it is really not so complicated in a sense if we intervene early. Often with anxious teenagers, we sort of guide them and coach them to sort of start facing some of the fears. But I see a lot, in anxiety disorders are so common in adolescents. Mood disorders, another one, like especially depression. And we really try to help teens to, when they feel down and depressed, we practice some opposite action, pushing back on depression and try to what we call behavioral activation. Like when the depression tells the teen to not get out of the bed or not go to school, we really try to coach and help them to get out of that if possible. Sometimes we use medications to support. But most commonly, I see depression and anxiety in teenagers. And there are other, substance uses sort of very common, especially cannabis is very common. And we always worry about that, like exposure to cannabis in a developing young brain. Disordered eating and body image is another one. Self-harm is common, especially with depression. And often we see these early signs and symptoms, like middle school age or early high school age.
Can you help us with some of the more typical signs that there might be a problem? And I realize that will vary from anxiety disorders to eating disorders to mood disorders and so forth. But any guidance you can provide in terms of what to look for, too much sleep, lethargy, whatever the case might be?
Yeah. I think it might be helpful to kind of break down this, like the different disorders. For example, depression can come as sadness, but depression can come also as irritability. Right. And every teenager a little bit moody and irritable, and that's kind of normal. But if a teenager is persistently sad or irritable to the point that they don't enjoy life anymore, I think the differentiation is also part of the, like functionality. We look at what the functioning is. If their mood is so strongly different than their usual self, and then they can't function in the world the way they want to, that's a reason to seek help. And the help doesn't have to be medication for every case, right? I think one of the concerns and kind of stigma of seeking help is this sort of concern that, if I have a mental health disorder, it has to be like some sort of, like I need to be in the hospital, or a lot needs, like sometimes having a counselor where the teen can talk about things and learn some good skills to cope with strong emotions or anxieties can maybe the only thing they need. So I think that's also important. Not every problem needs a very heavy intervention. Like sometimes having one therapist where teen meets regularly and learns some skills to cope with big emotions, maybe that's the only thing they need.
How about anxiety disorders? Some signs to watch for? So
with anxiety disorders, a lot of times they may show early signs even as a young child. And what we see is that as the demands increase in adolescence, so for young children, for example, parents do a lot of social piece, like setting up play dates or connecting the kids with other kids. And I think these dynamics rapidly change in adolescent period, and teens have to kind of navigate all these complex relationships by themselves. And anxiety can show up as, a teenager who's really struggling to connect with friends, avoid social interactions. Sometimes specific phobias can come up. Sometimes obsessions can come up, teens doing a lot of rituals to overcome those fears or anxieties. And I think then, again, when the parents notice that their teen they're not, functioning the way they should, they're not hanging out with friends, they're not attending school the way they should, or their life is really consumed with these, intrusive, anxious thoughts, and they're constantly worried and constantly seek reassurance from parents, that's the time really important to seek help. And often, especially for anxiety disorders, as a parent, when you see your child struggle, all you want to do to make them feel better, right? Like you want to reassure them. You want to say that the world is not as scary as you think. But specific to anxiety disorders, we actually try to help kids, teenagers to sort of stay away from that reassurance. And we teach parents, do not reassure. I know you want to, that feels like the right thing to do. But part of the anxiety treatment is sort of being in the world and then actually experience it. It's not as scary as you think. So it's sort of some of our natural parenting tendencies may not align very well with the anxiety treatment.
Kind of speaks to the importance of involving parents in that treatment process as well, which we'll circle back to. As we continue to look at these different disorders, though, and some of the early warning signs, what about eating disorders? What can parents be watching for?
Yeah, and again, I think there's a societal component, right? Especially girls and the influence of, social media. What is normal has shifted so much over time. What is viewed as normal shifted so much over time. I think, and eating disorders, kids hide it. So like it is hard to recognize for parents. I mean, the kids who, for example, kids who restrict and lose a lot of weight tend to wear like very like a big clothing, like these huggy, like big sweatshirts to hide how thin they are. I think, like pediatricians, like these annual visits, regular visits with pediatrician, they are a great resource to recognize disordered eating. And I think for parents, if they notice their kids, like there's a big change in their eating habits, or there's a lot of conversation about their body image, like how big they are or how much they need to lose weight, and like these concerns are active in conversations, I think important to sort of seek pediatrician support to see if something is off. And I think, unfortunately, that's a so common problem. And it's also like it's very hard for teens not to be impacted by all the conversation about like what is the ideal body should look like. And I think there are a lot of efforts to change that. I think even in the media and social media, there is more awareness, the negative impact of eating disorders, and how we should watch our language and how we should view a normal and beautiful differently. But again, like I think for the parents, I really see pediatricians as a wonderful first line of support.
Do you see personality disorders developing in teenagers?
So I think the way we look at the personality disorders, and I think maybe it's important to think about personality in general, right? We all have our personalities and we have our personality traits. And for teenagers, like as they grow up as a teen, they figure that process out. They sort of start to understand what kind of person they are, and what kind of things they like and don't like. We try not to diagnose personality disorders as much as we can in adolescent period because their personality is evolving and changing. So usually that process needs to go through in order to really consolidate the personality. So there's a sort of a consolidation process of who you are as a person happens during adolescent period. And we're very mindful not to overly diagnose personality disorders in teens, but certain personality disorders, for example, borderline personality disorder that comes with, really big emotions and interpersonal skill deficits, and they can have early signs in adolescent period, and treatment like dialectical behavioral therapy is wonderful to intervene. So even if we don't always diagnose personality disorder in teens, and we see these early signs concerning for emerging personality disorder, we seek help. I recommend seeking help, good therapy, evidence-based therapy, and they can really change the course of the person, right? We don't have to wait until a personality disorder fully emerges. When we see early signs, we seek the right therapy to sort of intervene as the personality develops. So it develops in a way that is not a problem, not a mental illness.
One of our goals is to weave in some questions from viewers today, Esra. And because you just touched on this, let me go ahead and weave this one in right now. For teens showing emerging traits of BPD, borderline personality disorder, is there an advantage to getting them formally diagnosed before the age of 18? I think you just touched on this.
That's very good question. I think it really depends on person to person. So for some teenagers and families, having a name for what they're going through is very helpful. It can really give them some sort of like a closure or like make sense of things. So it can be very helpful. Some of the families and some of the teenagers really like the idea of calling this something, so we know there's a treatment for it that we can seek. For other people, for some of the teenagers, having a name attached to what they're going through can feel labeling, can feel overly diagnosing. And for them, it's not a good thing. So I really see this as a case-by-case thing. And it really depends on the need of the person. I don't think there's nothing wrong to call, if a clinician sees a set of problems as borderline personality disorder and a 15, 16-year-old, I don't see the problem to call it what it is. But I'm always mindful what the diagnoses are for, because they're not always helpful, for not every person. Like if someone needs a diagnosis and helps them to sort of make sense, great. If it is something that feels more of a label and not so helpful, we do not need to call it something.
Just to round out this section, as we look at some of the teen disorders that are more common, mental health disorders, substance use disorders, you've mentioned them as well. What should parents and other adults be watching for in teens?
Yeah, I think, it is, especially cannabis, it's so common, and that comes up a lot in our clinical practice. And views towards cannabis has evolved over time too, like as if it's not that dangerous. Honestly, cannabis is really dangerous for a teenager. It's not. It's okay for, I don't want to okay anything, but it's very different to be exposed to cannabis as a teenager versus, using cannabis as an adult. In a developing, emerging brain, exposure to cannabis can impact motivation, can impact mood, actually lowers, this is like there's a very nice study came out of about this, that it can lower IQ points, especially younger exposure. The younger we expose brain to cannabis and persistent exposure, like I'm not talking about smoking once in a while, but repeatedly, persistently exposure to heavy doses of cannabis in a young brain has all sort of negative impacts from cognition, memory, IQ, and motivation, and mood, like irritability, low frustration tolerance and all that. So when we see teenagers repeatedly smoking cannabis, we really try to understand what that is for. And there's usually a reason, right? And try to support the teen in ways to either cut down on, reduce how much they smoke, or limit how much they smoke, even if they're not ready to quit yet.
You've referenced a couple of times the value of reaching out for professional help. How does a parent or another adult go about doing that? What's the starting point? Where do you turn?
Yeah, I think that is, it is a challenge for parents. There's so much need to find professional and good mental health treatment, and there's so much need, and the capacity doesn't always match with the need. I do advise to starting with the pediatrician, because that's usually the first clinician who knows the family and the kids. And then pediatricians have certain resources. They can help families connect with a therapist. I think starting with a therapist, especially for young kids, is important. If things feel more complicated or not as straightforward, or pediatrician needs more support, I think we're getting a consultation with a child psychiatrist is really important. But I do see pediatricians as a first point of contact, and finding a child therapist is a first point of contact. And depends on, how, the assessment and, what kind of need the teen needs, and they can make the decision whether further treatment, more intensive treatment involving child psychiatry, or involving more intensive services needed or not. They can help parents figure that out.
It can be intimidating at times for a parent or an adult to reach out to a professional in terms of not knowing whether this individual is the right person to be working with their child. Do you have some screening questions, for lack of a better way of putting that parents might use?
Yeah, I think that's hard. I think one of the other, I'm also thinking, it is hard to kind of seek sometimes help, because the parents may worry about maybe they did something wrong, or it's their fault. Like there could be a lot of feelings when it comes to seeking mental health support. I really feel like for mental health care, person's credentials, training is important, but also like how they feel in the room with the person, whether it is a good match or not. So therapy is a match process, not like a good therapist may not be the best match for a certain just sort of going for an initial meeting, going for a consultation, spending some time and then see how the kid responds to it, like how the teenager responded, whether the teen wants to sort of continue connecting with the person or not. Sometimes we also see that teenagers are not ready to seek help, but parents want them to seek help. So that could be another conflict with that. I think I always advise parents to seek parent coaching if their child is not ready to be in therapy. So if the child is not interested in seeing a counselors, parents can get parent coaching support, and that would be a really wonderful way to start, mental health treatment with the parents, learning specific tools that are unique to their child's needs, and then that can really help the child to get into treatment as well.
We're going to talk more specifically about treatment processes that are available for teenagers and how that looks for a family dynamic. Right now, though, I want to weave in a couple more questions about societal pressures. You touched on this, but let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between lifestyle advertising and social media and teen mental health.
Yeah, it's a complicated topic because, in some ways, for some teenagers, especially those who are so disenfranchised and they're not feeling connected with the world around them, so sometimes certain connections in the social media, online connections can feel very validating, especially for teens who have an environment that's not validating for them. So I can see that sometimes benefits of having an online community, but there is so much more to social media, and I think it is an unfiltered, wild community out there, and it can be negatively impactful for a lot of teens. And sometimes we see teens spend too much time online, being really having a very inner rich world online, but their real life is neglected. So all these kind of components are important to keep in mind. Again, I'm not saying, social media is a source of evil or anything like that, but I think there's real concern how much in a virtual world, teens and adults and all of us spending, and how much missing the real world, real connections. And I think that's a great problem of a modern world we live in. And when you put a developing, very vulnerable brain in that environment, I can understand how parents will be very concerned about protect that developing brain from the influence of things out there that it's very hard to control or filter or navigate.
We had a related question come in about teen comparisons with others in a peer group and what parents can do to help their teens navigate that inevitable tension that can develop in terms of being compared to others in their peer groups.
Yeah. I think, again, so this interpersonal dynamics, teens learn this by experience, how to navigate conflict, what to do when they feel excluded. The bullying is not always physical bullying, it could be emotional bullying, relational bullying. Sometimes kids bully other kids by just excluding them from social connections, and they can be very brutal and might hurt more than the physical aggression. So these are the things, kids navigate, especially in middle school, especially as they're not little kids anymore. They're in this sort of big, chaotic middle school. So intense, the friendships are intense, and expectations are different. So it can be really, really hard. I do recommend, so with the parents, I think having, maintaining a line of communication with the kid, for a kid to be able to reach out to the parent, and for a kid to not feel judged or not feel told what to do by the parent. So that really helps that line of communication open. Sometimes it could be parents, if the parents are struggling to maintain that connection, and it's not parents' fault. I just want to say that sometimes it's really hard to maintain that line of communication with the teens. Bringing a therapist, using school guidance, reaching out to pediatricians. So having a stable adult who gets things in the kid's life is really important to navigate those conflicts. And the kids need to learn these skills, what do you do if a friend is so unfair to you? How do you sort of grow out of that? How do you navigate that conflict? These are the processes that the kids learn as they grow, as develop.
Let's talk a little bit more about how parents can have those difficult conversations with their teens. You sent me an article to read, which I found very interesting, about motivational interviewing. Can you talk about how that plays into this whole process?
Sure. Motivational interviewing is a clinical technique we use when we work with clients who have ambivalence. And ambivalence is sort of being unsure about things, right? And that's the core of being a teenager. Teens are naturally ambivalent. They want parents to help them, and they don't want parents' help. So it's hard to win in arguments with teenagers. And some clinicians sort of adapted some of these motivational interviewing techniques into parenthood. And sort of, I think, just to kind of summarize a little bit, how it is hard to talk to teens. It's hard to intervene at teens' problem. It's very easy to have conflict with teens. And how can parents talk to them in a more productive way? It's sort of a kind of good sort of concept to think about. I think, first of all, for parents to hold a couple of pieces of information in mind. One is teenagers need to feel in control. The world is so out of control for them, and they want to be in charge. They want to practice being in charge. They want to be understood, and they want to feel confident about the decisions they make. So that is sort of starting the conversation by empowering the teen, even if their decisions are not what we would decide. Kind of empowering, showing that understanding, showing that value is really good place to start. There's, usually when our kids come to us with problems, or friends or anyone, like there's this urge to fix, right? Like someone come to you, I have this and this is not working. And as a parent, like parents would just want to just fix the problem, right? Like that's what parents do. They fix problems for their kids. I think that's an important urge to withhold, because when we problem solve the teens, they do not want that. They don't want us to come up with solutions. They want to come to the solutions by themselves. I think sort of giving up that urgently fixing problems and just being in that listening mode is really important. And listening is hard. I mean, I think sometimes the parents come to me and say, I listen, but my child doesn't think that I'm listening. There's something called reflective listening. We practice a lot in clinically. That can be very helpful for parents. So, for example, their teen is telling them something happened, kind of repeating what they heard, what the parent heard. So I heard you said something. Is that the case? That sort of gives the child a feeling that, okay, my dad is really listening to me. It also gives them an opportunity to reflect about what they said, right? Like the teen, like, oh, this is what I said. My mom is reflecting this on me. Okay, this is what I said. So it kind of creates this space of reflections, really helpful for a teen to think about what they actually what they said, what they talked about. They also feel they're understood and heard. Then they hear their parent kind of paraphrasing, repeating what they just said. The other important thing is, while listening to teenagers, is to sort of being curious. Sometimes we miss that curiosity because as a parent, you just want to come in and fix things, and you kind of assume that you know what's going on. Sort of like dumping those assumptions and approaching to the problem with curiosity, like asking these open-ended questions, like, help me understand, tell me more. What did you like or dislike about this? Sort of creating the space for teen to say more, talk more, and then parent approaching this with curiosity, like, I want to learn from you. Like, what happened and I don't, so I want to learn from you. There's one other point I want to make is, as a parent, like, especially if you have young kids, you like to praise them, like, great job, you did this, and you did so well. So the praise has to change for adolescents. So what we call more like affirmations. And what I mean by that is for parents to, rather than just say, yay, good job, like that's for little kids. But the teenagers, look for things that you can admire. Look for things that show their strength and their values, and then sort of comment on that. I see that you did this X, Y, and Z. Like, that's amazing. I'm so impressed by this. And you did this so well. So it is not a yay, good job. It is more like, I'm recognizing how wonderful you're doing these things. And I'm admiring you for that. And that is much more, it's so valuable, so authentic for the teens. And they really appreciate that. And I think, the other piece is when there are problems and the parents sort of really holding that urge to fix. One way of approaching is that asking the teen how they would like to handle it, right? Rather than just jumping into solutions, you hear a problem and then teen has you can ask, okay, what would you like to do about it? How are you planning to handle this? And the teenager can come up with a solution. That makes no sense, right? Like, let's remember this again. Teenagers don't have the part of the brain that makes good judgment. That part hasn't fully developed yet. So their solutions may not be what we would choose. And then help them understand that by just asking, right? Okay, I hear that's what you would like to do. What are the pros and cons? Like, how is that? Like, help me understand, how is that going to play out? Have them see the pros and cons, have them sort of assess, like, create space for the teen to really understand decisions they make and sort of like help them to kind of see next steps with those decisions. And then when you put all these efforts in, the time to listen, reflect, be curious, ask all sort of good questions, open questions. And then if you want to make a suggestion, ask for permission. That's what we do in motivational interviewing technique. Like, would it be okay if I share what I think? Can I suggest something? And then if you get permission, by all means, give your opinion. If you don't if you don't have permission to share, hold your opinion. Because if you give your opinion without being asked, they're not going to listen to it, no matter how good your opinion is. So I think it's really important to sort of creating that space and then giving your solutions if you're asked to. And then the other, I think one final point about this is sort of, we're not expecting parents or even like clinicians to do this perfectly. Like they'll be making like errors, like parents are humans and they'll be upset. And I think one important thing is to have a sense of kind of like holding that responsibility a little bit and not be shy from apologizing if things go wrong. Like if the teen feels misunderstood, apologize. Just say, I'm very sorry. That's how, like, I didn't mean to do this, but I understand that's, how that impacted you. I'm very sorry about that. So having this sort of like shifting power dynamics a little bit, equalizing that, and doing it without, I'm not saying parents should allow also, like, parents hold the responsibility for the child and they need to keep their teenagers safe. But when it comes to creating space for more less heated conversation, more process-oriented conversation, these could be really helpful techniques for parents to try.
Makes sense all the way around. And many of those are very small things, but I can see how they can make a big difference. Esra, let's pivot and talk a little bit about formal treatment right now, because there are many different ways that can go. And obviously treatment for an anxiety disorder is different than that for a personality disorder and so forth. But generally speaking, what are some of the considerations, inpatient versus outpatient, when to involve the family and when not to involve the family, taking kids out of school? Talk to us about some of those considerations that parents have to weigh.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so involving families, we would love to involve families. I think, child psychiatry is family psychiatry because, what parents parents can have a parenting style that can work very well for one child. And if they have a child with different needs, their parenting style may not be the best fit. And that's nothing wrong with the parenting, right? Like they just need certain tips and tools and skills to navigate parenting for that particular child. So I think involving parents and helping parents to navigate that challenge is really important. That's why I always recommend parent coaching. Parent coaching doesn't mean that you don't know how to parent, you know how to parent, but you may need certain tips and tricks and tools that would meet the needs of your particular child who needs certain needs and vulnerabilities. From like inpatient, outpatient, like I think for typically a lot of kids start treatment as an outpatient. Inpatient is much like that's the highest intensive care we provide, and that's usually saved for teens, like kids who are not safe. Like if we worry about safety, suicidality, then we do recommend being in a safe, doing treatment in a safe environment, which is inpatient. Sometimes kids who are so non-functional and struggling to meet the basic needs like eating or taking care of their body, sometimes those kids need to be in the hospital to care more, may need those intensive services. That's usually the safety and meeting basic needs. If we have concerns about those, then we usually recommend hospital-based care, what we call inpatient level of care. The outpatient services can range from once a week therapy to 3 times a week therapy to 5 days programs, day treatment programs. So it kind of varies based on the need of the child and the family. And it's usually decided by like a discussion between the child and the parent and the clinical team, right? Because the clinical team can have an idea, but if the kid is not ready for that intensive level of care, it may not be the best to push a child to more treatments. Like there's also like preparing to be readiness, what the kid is willing to do, respecting sometimes we can if we're worried about safety, but for the most part, motivating the kid to seek treatment and not like have them feel forced treatment is important concept. So I think that for the intensity of outpatient is sort of between a discussion between clinical team, the child, and the parents.
What about the broader team of support? You've got educators on the school campuses. You've got clinicians. You've got pediatricians, for example, involved in the mix as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you can approach this from a team approach?
Yeah. I think this is sort of it's a large team, right? This sort of connected network. And a lot of times, families may not end up ever seeing a child psychiatrist. A lot of things can be handled or can be treated without needing ever inpatient level of care. So often pediatricians are first point of contact, and pediatricians have their own resources, right? Sometimes they have a therapist in their clinical practice. Sometimes they have access for consultation to psychiatrists. So they have, for many pediatricians, they have some, not all of them, but many have some sort of resources that they navigate when the kids and families come for help. The schools are another source of support. Like a lot of schools, they have guidance counselor, and depends on the school. These supports can vary. It's not the same in every school system, but school guidance counselors are another wonderful first step to reach out, and sometimes they have the bandwidth to support, and if not, they help kids to connect with other therapists. And I think parents are key in this support system, right? It's sort of like the way we think about broader treatment is sort of a network of good adults in the kid's life that supports the kids. Could be the school, could be the teachers, right? Like teachers can be a wonderful, wonderful resource. Could be the pediatrician, could be a therapist, could be a psychiatrist. So it's sort of a network of adults who are there to support the teen, and depends on the intensity of the struggle, that changes number of adults or what context they operate in.
Let me work in a few more audience questions. One is this: is the increase in gun violence impacting more teenagers?
So, I mean, what we know, this is sort of broader than the adolescent mental health, but access to guns, access to ways to hurt yourself increases the chances of hurting yourself. So when we do suicide screening, that's one of the questions we ask: is there any guns in the house, and is the gun locked? So the reducing access to lethal ways could be guns, could be pills, could be sharps, and certain means like guns are much more mortal than others, right? But yes, the short answer is, it is bad, and it impacts everyone, and it's not good for teens to have any access to weapons like that. And it's usually impulsive decisions. Like suicide is a very complex phenomena, but a lot of times it is especially for teenagers because they're impulsive by nature. Like again, I'm sort of kind of repeating this a little bit too much, but teen brain is an impulsive brain. They make decisions in a snap second and they regret later on. So keeping them safe from these impulsive decisions and removing all sort of little ways is one way of it is really important to keep them safe.
Let's, as we look at the clock and see our time winding down a little bit, let's talk about some important resources for parents. Are there books that you would recommend, organizations we could point people to, crisis hotlines? What should we know?
Yeah, there are many hotlines. There are hotlines. There's a new hotline, 988, is a great resource. It's kind of relatively new. But there are hotlines that the teens themselves can call and the families can call. There are also organizations, National Alliance for Mental Illness is another one. Often they run family groups. I think it's sort of the way I kind of see this sort of support system, like there's a local support, pediatrician, school, a step like a local therapist, psychiatrist, and then there's sort of more of an organizational level. There's a crisis management, and there is sort of supporting kids and families, and kind of feeling that you're not the only one, right? Like anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicidality, these are so common. And being around other people who kind of go through the similar things and who navigated what you're trying to navigate now can be a very powerful tool to not feel isolated. I think some of the organizations like National Alliance for Mental Illness serves this function really well to kind of connect families together, so they don't feel that they're the only ones going through. And then when it comes to specific resources, I mean, I think there are organizations for every sort of subgroup of treatment providers. So, for example, I work with a lot of kids with OCD and anxiety, and there's a wonderful website for from International OCD Foundation and many resources in there, including finding a therapist. So I think looking for resources specific to what the teen is going through is one thing, but also kind of larger communities to support kids and teens are also very important.
Viewer wants to ask you about resources for parents and families, which I think is very important as well, that self-care element for a parent who's trying to navigate these challenges with their teen. That can take a lot out of a person. So what would you suggest on that front?
Yeah, I think it just sort of like this, again, I'm always thinking about stigma because sometimes parents feel bad about seeking help and as if they didn't do a good job as a parent, which is really not the case. And it's very important to sort of put that feeling aside and be open to seeking guidance and help. With the challenging parenting experiences, it is really a good thing to seek parent coaching. Like it is, you're actually doing the right thing by seeking parent coaching. I think for parents who struggle themselves with mental illness, like anxiety, depression, or just like being a parent of a teen can be very challenging. Seeking their own support and therapy is important. Because kids, I mean, teens or young kids, they're like really pick up whatever they see in the environment, right? If the kids struggle, their parents, see their parents struggling, they model that. Like we all model, growing up, we model what we see in our environment. And the most influential environment is the home environment. So I think for parents to really prioritizing their own mental health and seeking help if they're struggling, very helpful for their children, especially for their teenagers.
You mentioned stigma, and that reminded me that I wanted to circle back to that topic and ask you about campaigns that are trying to increase awareness around teens and mental health challenges, and athletes speaking out and other influencers, if you will, speaking out about their mental health challenges. Is that making a difference?
Yeah, I think those are the kind of like I see the good impact of social media. When we see these like TikToks or Instagram posts of influential figures really talking about their own struggle and how they come and manage their own anxiety or depression or eating disorder or self-harm, or borderline personality disorder, like that can be really normalizing experience for a lot of kids and families who feel so isolated because it's not spoken out loud as much. There's whole stigma on mental illness as if like you can talk about if you get a lot of support if you have a medical illness, but when it's psychiatric, it feels much more isolating. So I think it's really good to see all these, influential figures being out there and talking about their own experience and normalizing it. That has such a positive message. And I really, really value it a lot. And I think, that's sort of a first step. And it is a step towards normalizing mental illness, normalizing seeking help for psychiatric illness. And I think that is I think the new generation and the kids are in a different wavelength, in a good way, when it comes to normalizing mental illness and seeking
Let me
help.
squeeze in just a couple more questions before we let you go. Systemically, what's missing from the equation or what needs more attention?
That's a big question. I don't know if I probably need another, hour for this. There's so many pieces, but I think, one of the pieces is really having better system to reduce the time in between wanting help or getting help. Like that usually takes a while from asking for help and getting help. And I think some of the new initiatives like Massachusetts, as a state tries really hard to reduce the time for and there's emergency crisis services. But I think that's one of the important pieces, like expanding mental health workforce so we can all meet the needs of the community and the teenagers. And also like access to good evidence-based treatment, counseling might be enough for one patient, but for a kid with OCD, for example, we need an exposure and response prevention therapist. So certain problems need the specific evidence-based treatments, and expanding on those are really important. And on a community level, I mean, access to, for example, inpatient beds is a huge, huge problem nationwide. Like when a kid is in crisis and they need to be in a hospital to be safe, they can wait for days in emergency rooms waiting for a bed. So all these things are kind of systemic issues, need like systemic solutions. And it's not a matter of a child or a clinician to fix. It's sort of a broader problems. And I think, in Massachusetts, in our state, there are a lot of conversations and efforts towards addressing these. But again, these are big systemic problems, need really big solutions. And the core is reducing the time between seeking help, needing help, and accessing getting the help. So we want to really narrow that gap, because the longer we don't treat a problem, bigger and harder it becomes, and it's harder to treat it.
And as we're finally, I'd like to wind up our webinar series segments with a hopeful note. And I'd like to ask you to speak to a parent or an adult right now who's helping a teen navigate their challenges and feeling a little overwhelmed by the whole process. You've seen so many lives turned around through the work that you and others are doing. Speak to that if you would.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. This is like a really nice way of kind of wrapping up. I think I want to really point out how resilient kids are. Kids are amazingly resilient, and they bounce back much better than adults. Like the kids can struggle immensely to the point that they stay in the hospital for a long period of time, sometimes months, and then they can bounce back from it. I think kind of important, like it's a wonderful thing, seeking support, getting services, as intensive as it sounds, could be staying in the hospital. Those are the hardest, most crisis moments kids and the parents feel. But really holding the hope that kids are wonderfully resilient, and by the right treatment, good treatment, early treatment, they can bounce back and they can be wonderful functioning adults who know how to manage this, right? I think that's why we really emphasize on adolescent mental health. Let's give the tools to kids early on so they can sort of learn how to navigate all these challenges. And then when they become like adults, they start the world with a really much better understanding of how to navigate all these complexities and mental health disorders, but also kind of like coming out of an adversity with this resilient skills. I really believe resilience of the kids, and it's not just my belief, it's also research proves that over and over again. Kids bounce back from adversity really wonderfully. And holding that hope and not being shy from seeking treatment and not defining a kid's life by a moment of crisis. So that's also another important point. Like when a kid is in a hospital or really struggling, cannot function, that's not how their life is defined. It's just a hard moment in their life, and they will bounce back from it with the good support, right support they get.
I love your passion for your work, Esra. Thank you for sharing that passion and all your expertise with us. This hour has just flown by. We're going to have you back on for more, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for all of you who have joined us on the webinar today, thank you so much for your time. We very much appreciate it. On behalf of McLean Hospital, I'd like to wish you a wonderful day.